Good evening. I am Valita Simpson, the director of Woodson Regional Library on the south side of Chicago. My first day on the job at Woodson was on Juneteenth of last year. Yes, last year, 2020, a year to remember. At that time, we had experienced several brutal months of the COVID-19 pandemic, and all of a sudden, our daily routines and plans were disrupted. People were losing lives, loved ones, jobs, and then we experienced that nearly 9-minute video death of George Floyd under the knee of a police officer. We witnessed worldwide outrage, protests, and civil unrest. This time last year, the New York Times bestseller list largely consisted of books about race and white privilege in America. And I had just landed a dream leadership job in this global city. My opportunity to serve the South Side, my community, with neighborhoods experiencing disparities and loss from every angle. At that point, it was imperative for me to create a social justice program at Woodson Library, establishing a safe space for intellectual and productive dialogue. The Carter G. Woodson Reading Circle on social justice was born and began in September of 2020. And today we are participating in a spinoff of that social justice reading circle. Welcome to the Chicago Public Library's inaugural Juneteenth Reading Circle. This evening, we have an enthusiastic all-star panel of scholars and thought leaders ready to discuss Chicago author Richard Wright's novel, The Man Who Lived Underground, and the significance of its release nearly 80 years after it was written. Chicago Public Library is offering this discussion in partnership with the city's Together We Heal initiative, a journey aimed at building racial healing by encouraging every Chicagoan to do their part to foster racial healing, learning, and restoration in every neighborhood across our city. The initiative seeks to promote civic unity by encouraging Chicagoans to connect across lines of difference and support a collective conversation about our truth and our promise as a city. Before we get started, I would like to give you some insight on what you can expect. First, you will see a conversation between Library Commissioner Chris Brown and the editorial director of this novel. Next, I will introduce our esteemed Reading Circle facilitator and turn things over to her. Feel free to send questions and comments on the chat as we anticipate a very engaging and thought-provoking evening. Now I will turn it over to Commissioner Brown.
John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Chris. I'm thrilled to have the chance to participate in this Juneteenth event and also to talk about this extraordinary novel by Richard Wright about race in America, about police brutality, and about other things as well. So thank you for putting this together.
It feels very timely. How did you get involved in publishing this book?
Library of America and the Richard Wright estate. Library of America has been involved in publishing the writings of Richard Wright for a long time, going back 30 years to 1991, when Library of America published for the first time unexpurgated editions of Wright's first novel, Native Son, and his memoir, Black Boy, originally published in 1945. Both of those books were heavily redacted at the time at the insistence of the then very powerful Book of the Month Club. So when the Book of the Month Club came to Richard Wright and said, we will make these books a Book of the Month Club selection if and only if you make certain changes and certain cuts to the books, it was really an offer that Richard Wright couldn't refuse. In the case of Native Son, there was a scene that was cut entirely from the novel that Book of the Month Club feared would be offensive to its readers. It's primarily white readers. And they also asked that some of the language in the novel be toned down. In the case of Black Boy, and maybe I should say a little bit about the narrative for your readers who may not have it as freshly in mind as I do, but the first half of the part one of the memoir concerns Richard Wright's upbringing, his childhood in the Deep South in Mississippi. And then part two continues the narrative when Wright moves from Mississippi to Chicago. Well, Book of the Month Club didn't want the entire second half of the memoir. And so it was cut. And it was cut fairly late in the production process, which is to say, when the book was already in page proof. And so, and that was also true of Native Son. The cuts to that novel were made when Richard Wright had already seen the novel into page proof. And now we need to flash forward another 20 years. Julia Wright, Richard Wright's elder daughter, came to Library of America and asked us whether we might do a similar kind of recovery work for the man who lived underground. And so that then set Library of America on the long and painstaking work of collating all of the different typescripts, comparing them so that we understood the nature and the cause for the variance between the typescripts. And we based the novel on the last complete typescript.
The way that I really came to see this book was following all the news the day of the Chauvin verdict, and then also seeing that same day this book was published. I remember thinking, you can't plan something like that. What do you think that's saying right now, that it's being published today, that there's maybe a new appetite for these stories and maybe a little bit more of a reckoning around giving a voice to these narratives?
I think that's absolutely true, Chris, and spot on. I think too that it's a kind of sad relevance, and it's something that many reviewers in reviews of the novel have noted. But I also think it's true that this book was relevant in 1940. It was relevant in 1970 and in 2000 and in 2021. And it was certainly relevant even before, if we can engage in that kind of hypothetical thinking, it was relevant even before it was written, which is to say, there's been a long history of white violence against Blacks. And, as you say, I think this is a different time now. And the novel, I think, could not have been published in Wright's lifetime, but here we are in 2021 celebrating what I think is a major Richard Wright novel.
Well, John, I just want to thank you so much for giving me a little bit of time before the full panel discussion to chat with you a little bit, and I want to thank you and Library of America for all of your work to get this great Chicago novelist and this second novel published and accessible to us in such a timely moment.
Thank you for that insightful sample, Commissioner Chris Brown and Editorial Director John Coker from Library of America. Now we are ready to dip into the main feature. Generally, when libraries kick off new programs, as we are doing this evening, we tend to lean into our network of friends, which is exactly what we have done in the selection of our Reading Circle facilitator. Sylvia Ewing serves as the Director of Strategic Communications, Marketing, and Outreach at Elevate Energy. a Chicago-based nonprofit working on equity through climate action. Sylvia has worked on both sides of the microphone, helping nonprofits communicate effectively and manage change, and as an award-winning journalist in radio, television, and print. You can see Sylvia on PBS as a host of national pledge drives. Sylvia is an inductee to the History Makers African American Archives for Media and received the 2020 Illinois Humanities Award with her daughter Eve. The Comfort and Joy Stories of Hope Meditations for Happiness author currently serves as the board chair for Cartequin Films, is on the advisory board for the Center for Performing Arts at Governor State University, and on the board of Chicago Women Take Action. Please welcome our inaugural Juneteenth Reading Circle facilitator, Ms. Sylvia Ewing, an author and certified meditation teacher.
Thank you so much, Valida. That was very kind. And I welcome the audience. Thank you for choosing to be with us this evening. I want to ask for your interest and patience before we get to the conversation as we learn about this distinguished panel that is going to speak this evening. No particular order, just my notes. I'll introduce Juan Pereira, who is the Kurt and Linda Roden Professor of Law and Social Justice at Loyola University, Chicago School of Law. He's been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School and University of Virginia Law School. Pereira has written extensively on racial inequality and the legal history of race in the United States. He's the lead author of Race and Races, Cases and Resources for a Diverse America, and Immigrants Out. He's written in New Nativism and Anti-Immigrant Impulse in the United States. And he's also written many articles, many of which have appeared in the Harvard Law Review, California Law Review, New York University Law Review, and Michigan Law Review, among others. And Juan, give a little wave. People might be able to read your name, but it's always nice to have that contact. Thank you so much. Up next, Dr. Gerard McClendon, Associate Professor at Chicago State University and the author of Axe or Ask, Donda's Rules, and President Thug. He has earned an Emmy, an Associated Press Award, and an NAACP Champion Award. McClendon is Executive Director of the McClendon Scholarship Fund and is a board member of the Mid-America Club and the National Association of Wabash Men. He lives in Chicago with his wife, Quancia. Mary Patil, and give a little wave as well. Mary Patil is the Harold Washington Professor of Sociology and African American Studies and Chair of African American Studies at Northwestern University. She's the author of 2 award-winning books, Black Picket Fences, Privilege and Peril Among the Black Middle Class, and Black on the Block, The Politics of Race and Class in the City. She's published in the American Sociological Review, Social Forces, and the Dubois Review, among other journals. Patillo is the winner of the 2018 Weinberg College Community Building Award and has received grants and fellowships from Fulbright, MacArthur, and Ford, among others. And she is a founding board member and active participant in the Urban Prep Charter Academies, a network of all boys public schools in Chicago, and was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2020. Give a round of applause for Mary. This is the disability and I guess the Zoom way of applauding. Adam Green, longtime associate, one of my favorite guests. He's associate professor of history and the college and Masters of Social Science Division at the University of Chicago. and he's master of the social science collegiate division at U of C as well. He teaches and researches in US history, African American history, and the history of Black Chicago. He is the author of Selling the Race, Culture, Community, and Black Chicago, 1940 to 1955, and co-editor of Time Longer Than Rope, A Century of African American Activism. He's lectured on campuses and community venues. He's appeared on WTTW, WBEZ, Al Jazeera, and C-SPAN, and has been involved in community-based initiatives in New York, Chicago, and LA related to police accountability and educational justice. And last but not least, a dear old friend, Tracy D. Hall, who has been the executive director of the American Library Association since 1920. In this role, she oversees the oldest and largest library association in the world, made up of 57,000 members and more than 200 staffers. And Tracy is the first African-American female executive director in ALA's history. Over the years, she's worked with the Seattle Public Library, New Haven Free Public Library, Hartford Library, and Queens Library. And before that, she worked as Deputy Commissioner of Chicago's Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, also known now as DCASE, and as Community Investment Strategist in Global Corporate Citizenship at the Boeing Company, and has a host of academic credentials, including a double bachelor's, a MLIS, from institutions from Yale to the University of California, and also studied on the continent of Africa. That is a phenomenal panel. And I think it's time for us to just enjoy the conversation. So welcome everyone. And just to center this story, we have a working class person, a working class man, Fred Price, waiting for his paycheck on a Saturday, and things go terribly wrong in this book. It took 80 years to come to life, thanks to the Library of America. And as it comes to life now in 2021, there are so many parallels that make us think that what has changed. And so I'm just going to start asking many of you, and I'll start with you, Adam Green. What's your view of Richard Wright, and how might this book impact that view for yourself and for other readers?
Thank you, Sylvia. Before I answer the question, let me just say that it's a tremendous honor to join this panel. It's a special treat to be coming back to the Woodson Library, where I was part of the Harsh Advisory Board for many years, and it's a tremendous resource here in the city. And I also want to commend John Kukla for bringing this book, along with others, the Wright family and others, back into public view and public engagement. It's a tremendous, tremendous work. I think that one of the things that probably is important is just to be humble and acknowledge that a great writer like Richard Wright, you never know the full story. You don't have a sense of all that has been written. And I think that what Mr. Kukla shared, particularly about the ways in which his novels had been edited, they had been abridged, they had been censored effectively in terms of what was there, means that when you get something, anything that expands that writer's canon, but particularly something that the writer is saying is so tremendously representative of the highest level of his craft, that in a sense, he's proudest of this book, then you really want to sit and take notice. So I mainly feel, tremendously enriched by seeing what Wright brings before us. I'm struck and shocked at times, but not surprised by how relevant it is to the present day. And I see a lot of the signatures of Wright's work that are provocative and push us to question a lot of foundational assumptions that we have and give us little comfort. And in that sense, we become alert rather than despairing in relation to thinking about our current circumstance. So I feel views of rights were confirmed in my mind, but at the same time, they were deeply, deeply enriched.
Thank you so much. That's a great way to get us started. And I'll come to you, Gerard. Would you share your thoughts on right and the impact of this book?
Yes, it's a pleasure to be on panel with all of you as well. Adam, I think nailed it. You know, my research area is in perceptions, and Wright captures the essence of perception in The Man Who Lived Underground. He tells us, even if you don't fit the description, you're a suspect and you're guilty. Readers get this jolt from the book from the beginning. If you look at portraits, I'm talking about pictures, you can go on Google and look at pictures of Richard Wright. His face looks so soft and demure. He's a handsome man, but underneath the hood, he's angry, he's honest, and he's a calculating writer, you know, who becomes just an expert in the perceptions of Jim Crow, the perceptions of how whites look at Black people. The book strengthens what I know about Richard Wright. I think we've all read Native Son, Black Boy, but I find this aligned with The Outsider as well, you know, where you see some W.E.B. Du Bois elements of the veil, that double consciousness. Wright is angry, but he's not just angry, he's projecting what has been projected on him as it relates to Fred Daniels. When you read the book, you have more appreciation for all who've sacrificed. And we know that oppression is not born in a vacuum. I think that's one of the hallmarks of Richard Wright writing. Wright's character, Fred Daniels, is who? He's George Floyd, Amadou Diallo, Sandra Bland, and everyone else who has a hashtag or who we say their names constantly. So body cameras wouldn't have mattered in an innocent Black man is always guilty. Skin color, gender, perception. Richard Wright expresses the world of fear in timeless fashion in The Man Who Lived Underground. Frightening, debilitating towards the end, and just moving.
It is moving. And there was a biographer, a woman named Hazel Rowley, who said that it was too accurate a portrayal of arbitrary justice when people wanted hope. And that really blew me away when I read it. And you're so right about his observations of the day, because there's also a place where there's a white woman who saw him and they didn't believe her. And the cure for that was she should get married. But let's get back to Wright and let's keep going with these conversations. And I'm going to come to Tracy Hall, about your thoughts on how the book begins and the period that it portrays.
Yes. So first of all, I have to say that I don't think I'd been reading this book for a full 20 minutes when I wanted to throw it against the wall. It viscerally triggered me to a point that I had just a violent reaction because of what it speaks to is the expendability then and now of Black life. And the degree to which we have to interpret and I think consider Blacks in this country as, and especially the desire to go underground, because that's not lost on me. This period of how the notion of underground shows up again and again. So when we think about the period in which this was written, to be walking down the street in the 40s, was to put a Black body in danger. To be walking down the street, or Ahmaud Arbery running down the street or jogging down the street in 2020 is to put a Black body in danger, to put a Black man in danger, to be sitting in one's home, to be sleeping, to be entering one's home, to be in a park. So I think what it speaks to is a type of ongoing terrorism that Black people have endured in this country. But I just want to say something here about what I think Wright does and why Wright is so masterful with this notion of the underground. Because in positioning the haven for Fred Daniels as the underground, he places Fred beyond or below the white gaze. And then what he does is that he creates this place in which the Black gaze becomes powerful, omniscient, and extremely, I think, prescient in foretelling a future. And I want to hear what others have to say, but I think that what for a period of time, what he's able to observe and that he's able to observe in others is it really is foretelling of this present moment. So I will stop there.
Well, thank you so much. That's very well said and thought out. Let me ask Mary the same question. What are your thoughts about how the book begins and the period it portrays? And I'm on first names today, so all y'all at home have to respect them. This is also respect, but we're just family having a little library conversation.
Of course. So Gerard already pointed out that, how we meet Fred Daniels is just getting off work, just being paid. As he says, he had given his bodily strength in exchange for dollars with which to buy bread and pay rent for the coming week. And what we hear in that is Wright's solidarity with workers. And, Wright was a member of the Communist Party, and then he wasn't. But we see this throughout a lot of his essay writing is his solidarity with workers. And where that comes up again, one thing that I thought of in that little piece that you talked about, Sylvia, where he comes up from the underground, I'll just read it. He struck a match. Yes, he was in a basement and the usual steps led upward. He tiptoed to a door and eased it open. A blue-eyed white girl stood in front of a steel cabinet, her blue eyes falling on him. She turned chalk white and she gave a high-pitched scream and swayed. He bounded down the steps and raced to his hole and clambered through, replacing the bricks with nervous haste. I saw Parasite, the movie Parasite. That's the exact scene when the guy comes up and the little boy drops the cake. And that connection to workers, the folks who were underground in Parasite were cast off former household employees in this rich person's house. Two successive families of cast off employees in this person's house. So I really see in that opening vignette when we get Fred Daniels as a worker kind of making some solidarity moves that Richard Wright was invested in.
I think that's brilliant. And it also shows Wright's influence, international influence, Oscar influence in many ways. And I know, Gerard, you wanted to touch on this as well. So please go ahead with your thoughts on the period that the book portrayed as well.
Yeah, the period is interesting because you can see the juxtaposition of, as you all mentioned before, a time before. You can look at pre-slavery, during slavery, post-slavery, and then this is the heart of Jim Crow, and Jim Crow in some ways is even more insidious because you don't know what you're going to encounter on a moment by moment basis. This is what happens to Fred Daniels. He thinks that he can trust the officers. He's trying to tell them that he's an honest man, a hard day's work for pay. I work at the Wootons. I didn't do anything. He says that over and over in the book. I didn't do anything. What are you talking about? I didn't do anything. So it's this whole consciousness where he's trying to convince the officers that he's an upstanding citizen who wouldn't commit a crime but it doesn't work because of skin color. It doesn't work because of time, space, circumstances, spatial intent. It doesn't work because he's a Black man. And that's what makes things so difficult. You know, now we are in the age of high-tech lynchings where we can see body cams and cell phone footage. We can see Black men brutalized on a cell phone. It was a low-tech lynching back then. And the terrible aspect of a low-tech lynching in Fred Daniels is that he never gets exoneration and he's never believed.
Well, there's so much here. And if you're just joining us, this is the inaugural Juneteenth reading circle with the book, The Man Who Lived Underground, Richard Wright's book that was born 80 years ago, and thanks to Library of America and the Wright Estate is seeing life now. And I'm always happy to be with my friends at Chicago Public Library. We love the library. Adam Green, I want to come to you for this question, because I think you had some parallels to the present. This viciously enforced confession makes me think of the long reign of people like John Burge, you know, a white police officer, people like Lieutenant Watkins, a Black police officer who terrorized the CHA development, and other police who used the badge and the nightstick as a means to their own ends. What parallels do you see? What can we learn? And what's your thinking on what may have changed or not have changed? Adam?
So that's a really important question. I think it's at the heart of the topicality. It's certainly, as we were talking about before we went on air, important to think about what it was that Wright himself was aware of, presumably in the 1940s as he was writing this. The Wickersham Commission had met nationally between 1929 and 1931. People were aware of the third degree and the use of brutality in relation to police interrogations. People knew that summary justice was something that happened throughout the North in relation to unjustified shootings, criminal shootings on the part of police officers against African Americans and against others as well. But I think it's very important as we think both about the relevance of the work, but also the dialogue between this book and the larger context of action, activism, challenge, critique, accountability that's been sort of pushed forward, not only for the last 2 years, but for decades within the United States. And to think about Chicago, I think where we are, where we're convening this conversation, you know, is an important laboratory for that. We have, for instance, the outcry that came within the Black community at the police murders of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in 1969. Which in many ways began, I think, a kind of large-scale politics among local African Americans around police accountability. We have the Afro-American Patrolmen's League, which specifically was trying to point out misconduct again from the late 1960s. We have activism on the part of people wrongly convicted and on death row through the support work for Death Row 10, through the Innocence Project, through the Exoneration Projects, and a range of other initiatives to try to reverse convictions of people, particularly in the 1990s and 2000s. And as you just mentioned, Sylvia, there was a long period of activism related to John Burge and the torture ring that operated in Area 2 police station down in the 90s on Cottage Grove and then later on Area 3. And we should remember that John Burge was tapped in the early 1980s to be someone who might eventually rise to the rank of chief of police within the city of Chicago. That was actually a role that was imagined for him because he achieved results. He got convictions. He was able to put people down on death row. And as it turned out, of course, most of all, because of the work of people that were wrongfully accused themselves in terms of bringing light to this, we understand the corruption that was there. So I see great parallels, but I do see a significant difference. And I think it's important for us to wrestle with it a little bit in this panel. Wright imagined at a kind of level of existential philosophy the individual having to resolve this situation at the level of meaning by themselves. What Chicago's story, I think, has really indicated to us is that collective struggle is a different way to achieve meaning. And I don't raise that to sort of demean Wright's work or say that there's no relevance to consulting this, because I think the way that Wright is talking about the problem of Black existence in the face of terror and fear and injury and threat is very profound. But to imagine that Wright is giving us all of the solutions to that issue is to ignore the context of collective struggle, of people actually staying in contact and in solidarity with each other, along the lines, I think, of what Mary was suggesting a moment ago, around the kind of affinity towards workers and the workers' experience. Wright's solution is usually one of isolating individual action to resolve a crisis of existence. But there's a political solution, there's a solution of collective action that I think the Chicago story really tells. And I hope both of those stories are thought about in the context of this conversation.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to come to Mary on this question and then bring Juan back into the conversation. But your thoughts as well about what this can tell us at a time when many people are saying we need to reimagine policing.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of building on what Adam was saying in terms of broadening out the lens. You know, I think it's really about the structural problematic of policing, because you recall once Fred Daniels goes underground, he then sees at least 2 white people be also brutalized by the police in trying to extract false confessions from them, since he knew those white folks hadn't done the crime. And he sees them brutally beaten. And so here we get this reminder, both, I think it was Sylvia who mentioned that a Black police officer was on top of the brutality against Chicago Housing Authority residents, and that white police, so Black police officers, white police officers can be brutal against Black people and white people because of the way that this system is structurally breeds that violence. It is a system of violence. It is a system that, puts the state behind that violence. So that's at the core of many of the critiques of modern policing. It, of course, reaches its apex when it is exacted against Black folks, but it also brutalizes many people. And I think, there's this myth that white folks are in general protected by it. And of course, some white people are, but it is a brutal system that can then be turned around even on those who feel protected by it.
Thank you, Mary. And Juan, I want to give you a chance to weigh in both on the impact of this book as well as the period that it portrays.
You're on mute.
I really appreciate from my colleagues, so I'm glad to have heard and learned from them. So the book is brilliant in my opinion, and I really appreciate him writing about the police brutality from the point of view of a Black victim, a Black male being brutalized by the police. That's something that's unusual and very, very powerful. I think that's, for me at least, this is what gave it as much force and effectiveness and authenticity as a narrative that really, it turned my stomach in ways, and as it should. And I guess, that period of time, like most periods of time in the United States, it was a period of great violence against African Americans. And what interests me the most is how basically the decision to omit this chapter, apparently on the grounds that one of the reviewers thought it was, quote, unbearable. And, that's probably right, or a judgment that the audience would think it was unbearable. That seems fair. And I guess, following up a little bit on what Adam was saying, communal action and activism really is profoundly important. But there's another side that's also profoundly important, and that is community denial and suppression of these narratives. So when you have editors not publishing this narrative, it means that mostly white people never had a chance to grapple with the violence that police were inflicting on Black people. And that continues today. I mean, it's all around us. Consider, the struggles now to eliminate critical race theory, which would put me on unemployment. But, eliminate critical race theory. What else? The fellow who spoke at a Memorial Day ceremony describing the first Memorial Day, which was a group of African-American former slaves commemorating the deaths of Union soldiers who had been killed in the war. And they cut off his mic in the middle of his talk because the censors, the administrators, decided that the audience wouldn't hear that. So,
well, Juan, there's such a list. This revisionist history has many faces, including what happened at the Alamo for Mexican Americans. I mean, there is a lot that we're learning, but I want to come to you, Tracy, particularly with your previous role with the special events and really arts and culture here in Chicago. What is the role of culture, of art, of humanity? Should these fictional and factual stories help shape the future of policing as well?
Oh, absolutely. For all of the reasons why, I think we have sort of enumerated the reasons. I think that this text, like so many good works, really hold up a mirror to our lived experience. And in many cases, they allow, as Wright does, entrance into that sort of interior, because that's what's happening here. And also texts like this connect the dots between issues that we sometimes silo. So in this particular case, police brutality, mass incarceration, also connected with housing precarity, the idea that he's paying for his where he lives, like so many did, poor Black or white, low paid laborers, week to week. And also to connecting the dots to food precarity, which is really very important here. One of the things that I think a lot about is just the echoing of food deserts, and the fact that this is placed here in Chicago. The idea that in this book, Fred, the joy that he gets is relishing things like fruit, like pears, like apples, those types of things, as well as meat. But I want to just say something else too that I think that Wright does, and why I think texts like this work so well, is that they also amplify small moments and allow us to understand what's happening here. And in this particular case, and I think about this as an arts administrator, but also as a librarian, there are a couple of things that are happening here. First, Fred gains access, amongst many other things, to a radio. And at some point, he can't bear to hear the news. I want to think about that, because I want to think about information access, and I also want to think about the ability of the media. But the other that is most striking to me, probably, and I don't know why this stands out, is when he is able to access a typewriter and to write his name. That is one of the most quietly explosive moments, because it speaks to educational precarity. We're in a time in the 21st century, when, especially post-pandemic, where what we have seen, or during the pandemic, we saw that access to education, access to employment, and access to public health were all predicated on access to information platforms, and also digital information literacy. So when Fred has this moment of revelation, when he sees his name and he takes his time so that he can be satisfied and to type his own name without mistake, it speaks to another type of access. And, and again, of course, we're talking about a whole history of compulsory illiteracy. So I'm reading this novel in terms of what it can do. And that is the power of literature, and it's the power of art, because it connects experiences, it connects themes, and it gives us a sum total of who and what we are, and how some of the things that we may be experiencing are connected to other things that others may be experiencing.
Very well said. And Juan, I know that you've given a lot of thought to that question as well, the role of the humanities in these serious questions. You're on mute.
So telling the truth really matters. And,
Wait, can you say that again?
Telling the truth really matters. And part of what's beautiful about this book is that he speaks a lot of truth. He bears witness about police brutality, about the greater freedom he can live underground than above ground. So bearing witness really matters. And again, I'm struck by how the fact that most people are only learning now about the Tulsa massacre in 1921. And a lot more things that are not coming to me right now, but so be it. In order to learn how to respond appropriately, you have to have the factual predicate for it. You have to know the history, you have to know the violence, you have to understand it, and then I think take responsibility for it in some way. And this is almost entirely missing in our culture now. And that's one of the real limitations with respect to any sort of progress.
Well, let me say this time capsule that Richard Wright has given us may be opened at just the right time, because, coming back to Gerard, the man who lived underground shows that lynching and brutal police terror were not just a Southern convention, but white intimidation was everywhere. And I want to center and breathe for all the folks who, like Tracy, who wanted to throw the book across the wall. It is triggering. It is triggering, but it is a time to add that light to these topics because it is so real. So we're here to add more light than heat. Mm-hmm. But how did this pattern of fear-enforced Jim Crow and controlled behavior between the races shape our history?
I mean, think about it. Black people's behavior was more than the double consciousness of W.E.B. Du Bois. It probably was bordering on schizophrenia, because it's like, for every white person that I encounter, how do I behave? I mean, there were laughing barrels in the South where if something was funny to a Black person, you had to put your head in a barrel and not laugh in front of white people. You had to step to the side and let white people go by you. The nervousness of Black men on elevators, even today, is a form of violence. I mean, so the portrayal of an obvious post-slavery Jim Crow era for Richard Wright to cover is just brilliant. I mean, and let's think about it this way. See, America likes to wipe its hands clean as if it's some sort of, shining city on a hill, this beacon of liberty and freedom. Nonsense. The Nazi Party based its form of exclusion and xenophobic terror on the Jim Crow laws in the United States. Very few people know that. It's not even taught in schools. James Whitman's book, Hitler's American Model, points this out. Going back to art just quickly, though, George Orwell said it best. In a world of universal lies, the truth becomes a revolutionary act. We're living in that time right now where if you tell the truth, you may get ostracized. James Baldwin, the role of the artist is that of the lover. If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. This is what Richard Wright is doing. He's peering into our consciousness, and he's not just lambasting us, he is being didactic. He's teaching us. He's creating these wonderful characters that show us that we can be better people. So the role of the artist is, of course, to entertain, to advise, to expose, and present the best and worst of human drama. But there are some stories, going back to John Burge, that you wouldn't even believe in fiction. I mean, John Burge and his henchmen were using an electric box to shock the genitals of Black men to force confessions. That's just a brutal act. I interviewed Daryl Cannon a few years ago, and he was in tears in front of me describing that situation. So artists have a big platform. The classroom of an artist is much bigger than my classroom, and thank God for the arts. I do want to get this in just quickly, though. I love where the narrator in the book in omniscient form says, terrifying world of life and death above him, and the stark world of death and life near him in the underground. Mind says no, body says yes. Fear had claimed him completely. That is some of the best writing I've ever witnessed in my life. I got shivers. And to see that Fred Daniels saw that the rats in the sewer were more free than him in the beginning, frightening.
Well, very well said. And I want to give a call out to the Community TV Network and a group of young people who wrote and did the video Beyond the Nightstick a long time ago. Young people, Black and brown, who were telling that story. But catching our breath about so many of these images, the Wright family wanted the book printed with an essay as well. And I want to get to that, the memories of my grandmother. And it gives some insight into Wright's writing process for all of the budding writers out there, and tie back, if you will, his belief or his writing about his grandmother's belief in things felt yet unseen in the world. Was that connecting to his belief in Black folks overall, how he felt there was this connection and this that things were felt and not seen in the world? How does that impact his writing in your view? And Adam, I'm going to come to you for that.
So that was a question that I really was thinking about a great deal as I was reading that essay. And there's a characterization of Wright's grandmother by him as a rebel, ceaselessly, militantly at war with every particle of reality. And, this is not someone who's a nationalist, a reparationist. This is not someone who's, kind of seeking to foment armed rebellion within Black communities. This is a Seventh-day Adventist. And I think what Wright is getting at with that is something that speaks both to aesthetically what's realized within this book, but also philosophically, what's the ambition that Wright is after? And he speaks in this essay, starting ostensibly with his grandmother, but talking also about his own creative process. And I would characterize it as his ethical process. How do you live within the kind of world that Jared, Mary, Tracy, and pretty much all of us have described so far? It's a world in which you're insecure. It's a world in which your life can end. It's a world in which arbitrary abuses come at you in casual and summary forms. It's all of those things. It's unjust, obviously, because of that, but it's also absurd. Mm-hmm. It's absurd. And that's precisely why you need the laughing barrel in order to be able to somehow have an outlet in relation to that. And I think there's several points where Wright returns back to this motif in this essay about his grandmother. And he's saying, in a sense, his grandmother taught him this initially, and taught him this against his resistance because of the ways in which he was resisting being enfolded into religion, being enfolded into what he saw, he believed was a mystification of how to see the world. He spoke about the need for people to juxtapose objects and symbols that were opposed to each other, that could not be sort of reconciled. And that when one sought that level of meaning by experimenting, and I think that that's my deliberate use of that word, by experimenting with proposing new meanings. There's that wonderful sort of turn with his uncle and other relatives when he's saying, I want to forget English in order to be able to understand the sound of it. And implicit within that is to understand the meaning of it. That you have to deconstruct your commitments to the meanings that the world above ground is presenting, whether it's language, whether it's guns, whether it's tools, whether it's food, whether it's money. Money and jewels are used to adorn this room that he's in, and they have no exchange value in terms of his plans for where he's going to go in the future. So he's unplugging himself from that meaning system that exists within the world. And he says a couple of times in this essay, that's a peculiar genius of African Americans, to take things that are chosen from disparate and random areas, bring them together and create new fields, new systems of meaning to understand the world. This brings us, I think, to a last challenge, which comes up at the end of the book. And I think in some ways, Wright is explaining why he's making that choice. Everything that we've all said about the problem, the injustice, the abomination of how policing is done within the United States, particularly against Black folk, all of that is true. Why in the world then does Wright end this book and resolve Daniel's journey and experiment by willfully going to the police station and asking the very people who had brutalized him, come share my new meaning that I found, that ultimately results in his death? That's something that's difficult to process, I think, in terms of the sorts of conversations that we have today about resolving these questions at the level of consciousness and experience. But Wright is provoking and challenging us to recognize that to make sense of this meaning that is non-meaning, we have to move away from the easy rationalities, the easy logics. How do you get paid? How do you work on a job? How do you realize respectability in the eyes of the external society? And saying you have to exit those relationships, Wright is proposing, in order to be able to see the society for what it is, and then propose the truth that we're all advocating that people do. Now, I don't want to get shot in a sewer and go down at the end of, at the end of my life in relation to the interactions that are there. But that proposal of an experiment, which is realist and surrealist at the same time, proposing that experiment is one that sort of moves us to recognize that maybe the frames and references of consciousness that we consult, like maybe even justice, for example, are not necessarily adequate to meet the terms of our full existence and our full person. And that means that we have more questions than answers at the end of the book. He saw his grandmother as opening that degree of ambition in terms of understanding what does it mean to be a Black person. And I think the phrase he uses at the beginning of that essay, what does it mean for me to become a whole Black person that takes all of my experiences and understands a unity that isn't one that's necessarily translatable to anybody, least of all the police officers that have brutalized you a few hours ago.
I want to unpack and let some of that sit because there's so much there for people to think about. I think that it beautifully sums up both the essay and the spirit of the book that these experiences help to shape. But Tracy, I want to come to you as well as someone who's done this rooted work, who has a sense of our communion with ancestors. What did you take away from the essay and from his descriptions of his grandmother?
Well, I think Adam teed me up wonderfully to at least attempt an answer. I'm still sitting with that essay because I think that it has so many, as many layers as like an onion has skin. I think what he's trying to do there is so important. also think that the lesson that he learns from his grandmother is one that is about complete transformation. I think this sort of ontological experience of her faith and how it informs his understanding of just the life cycle for Fred Daniels is something that it feels to me to be quite complete and indelible. In a way, Fred has to go back, because this is in some ways a weird type of redemption story. This is in some ways how he is going to live again. There is, I saw so many overtures with us. I could hear hymns when I was reading. And again, I come back to his revelation at his own name. And we know that that is a trope. Walking on diamonds, walking on streets of gold. There is so much there. This is really, I think, a story of a kind of embodied spirituality that is not a Judeo-Christian one, but that actually speaks to me of how we understand the sacrifice as a way of living again. And I also want to mention, as I say this too, that I want to speak to something that I've heard here multiple people say, is that what we understand, I think also in non-Western traditions, is that we heal together, right? So that we don't isolate the sick or the infirmed, we heal within community. So I think that Wright understands that, but he's trying to tell us something. He wants to give Fred Daniels an opportunity to speak to us. This is a spiritual text in that way. He is seeing the church, and yet he's removed from the church. He is seeing the cycle of life. He is seeing the undertaker, because he's also looking at the undertaker, what he is rising above and what he can now clearly see. All of that is illustrative of a kind of, if you will, a kind of the cycle of life and the cycle of spirit and how one lives again. So I think I want to say that the reason why it's so important that the novel and the essay must appear together is because he is trying to connect the dots for us between this particular experience and his own lived experience. And I'm just going to use this word, the spiritual information that it gave him that makes writing this book such an, as he says, almost like an automatic experience in which he is able to give himself fully to the text and to be informed by the text. And you can see that with the watch, the dollars plastered on the walls, you can see that that Wright, who's a very controlled writer, is being taken someplace. He is actually on a journey, just like in some ways Fred Daniels. So I think that the collocation of the essay is necessary for the illumination, but I will submit that this is and was for me also a kind of spiritual text.
Beautiful. I'm reminded of that saying, we come this far by faith. And yet that faith, it is a very individual journey, isn't it, for the main character here, and the narrator helps us to feel that as well. You know, Fred is part of a world, but he is experiencing so much alone and on his own. Our time together has just, been phenomenal, and we still have a little more time to go. And we again are thanking the audience for participating. And I want to take a second to give a shout out to my friends at the library, from Chris Brown, Mary Ellen Messner, all the folks, our anniversary host, Valita. This is a library that appreciates powerful words and understands that there's no censorship. And Mary, as I continue in these last few questions, let me ask you any of your thoughts about this essay and the world scene, and the hidden world.
Yeah, what the essay was fascinating. It's we should have said some spoiler alerts when we started, because Adam surely spoiled the end of the book for y'all.
Well,
So
you all just read it anyway and read it again because you'll be mad the first time. So,
but the essay was really surprising to me, because there's nothing in the essay where Richard Wright talks about his decision around the portrayal of the very brutal scene with the police beating the main character, Fred Daniels. I was surprised by that. And so much of what we've talked about, which is obviously so central to motivating the book, didn't come up as so central for Wright in his inspiration for the book. Much more, kind of, as Adam used the word, existential questions about guilt, about being in the world and not of it. There are lots of tropes in this final essay that I think are very clear in the book, but they aren't all motivated by the opening part one of the book. So that was really surprising to me. I think the one place it comes in this essay is that Wright says to get to the point where he can really start his improvisation, because ultimately he says this is a work of jazz prose. So to get where Wright can start his improvisation, the main character has to get broken. And perhaps that scene is about breaking Fred Daniels from his attachment to society. And that's what Gerard started us with. I'm a good worker. I go to church. My employer will speak up for me. And none of these pleas stop the beatings. And so he's ultimately broken when he makes the decision to go underground. So we do see that in the final essay. And that then seems to be the scene that Wright needs to start his jazz improvisation, where, as Tracy says, Wright is on a journey. And that's where that journey underground begins. So I found it fascinating how frequently do you get to hear so much of what the author is thinking? Most of us finish a book and we're like, what was that about? And here, we get to hear at least what the author thought it was about, while also obviously experiencing it with our own takeaways.
well, thank you. And that reminding us of jazz, that is a worship in and of itself. Juan, would you like to add about anything about their grandmother and what the essay shows us about the process? And you might unmute yourself, please.
Well, like Mary, I think I was surprised that what for me was one of the most powerful parts of the book wasn't something he commented on. And I guess just briefly, I love the way he described his grandmother as somebody who could be like wickedly judgmental without partaking of the experiences that she was being wickedly judgmental about. I mean, that's rough. That's rough in your grandma. And
That's grandma.
What? Excuse me?
That's a grandma. That's what we do.
I just thought that was hilarious. So, leave it at that. I just haven't heard such an apt description of a certain kind of grandma. And I thought that was just terrific.
Well, and I think that speaks to the universality as well, because that's a grandma that can speak to many people. Let me ask you all, I want to paint a picture. One of the things that was a favorite part of my seeing the book, and I tell you, Gerard is really on point because we can see the visual behind him. But what I was taken by in terms of a mental picture was Wright as a youth on the stairs with the elders, talking, listening as they sat on the porch. And Adam mentioned earlier about how he wanted to not know English so he could observe it. And one of his uncles was, that boy is going to be in trouble. To me, that's a telling part of this in many ways. And it speaks to, his uncle might have thought he'd be in the kind of trouble that Fred got into. But that sense of wanting to be in the world, but not of it, it seemed to shape his experience. and the way he worked. It seemed to shape his career. So, Adam, I'm going to come back to you on that particular question as well, and what it shows us about this almost Zen-like perspective from a child.
So if I could answer that in a slightly different way, and I want to kind of uphold my reputation as a spoiler that Mary assigned to me a moment ago by bringing another piece out of the essay. He does refer to what might be seen as the kind of explanation of thinking about what we would think of as anti-Blackness or racialized brutality or, state violence or institutional violence or structural racism. I have a Kindle version, so it's in the essay toward the end. Still another theme, this is reading directly, suggested in a rather muted way, is the problem of the Negro. After all, Fred Daniels is a Negro, and Negroes in America are accused and branded and treated as though they're guilty of something. They don't know what they've been done to be treated so, all of which has made a lot of Negroes write a lot of impassioned books saying, look here, I ain't done nothing. Give me a break, for Christ's sake. And then Wright says, so much for that theme. And, I think that part of what he's getting at there is that for him, and this is Wright alone, as an individual who made a number of individual decisions, he left America, partly because of what he saw to be the anti-Blackness that was sort of established there, but partly also because of his frustrations about trying to navigate the resources within a broader Black community within the United States, as opposed to, say, the Negritude community or a Pan-African community of writers that he found in Paris. He saw a particular character to racism that was especially intense and obviously impacted him, but he saw it as a larger kind of problem of human brutality, of humans against other human beings. He also speaks, not as a child, but as an adult, about his own experience of false accusation. And though he doesn't go into it in detail, it's interesting in the 1940s that he's already written, I believe, a version of this in the second half of his biography of American Hunger, the Horror and the Glory, because he's talked about the ways in which he went under trial as a member of the Communist Party within Chicago. And I'm quite certain that that's what he's referring to. And those are African Americans and whites who are engaged in false accusation against him. And for those, don't worry about the spoiling, go to the ways in which he explains these situations, because Wright does this fascinating meditation on what it means to understand the meaning of accusation and the meaning of the trauma of false accusation when one has had to think about the deconstruction of your former self because of the disruption that that false accusation confronts you with, and then the reconstruction of a new self that has to do with coming up with a truth that can replace that former self. That's a fascinating, fascinating meditation on what it means to think about going through this experience. And, my encounters with Anthony Holmes or my encounters with Darrell Cannon, they say those kinds of things about the people that they've become on the other side of having come out of that by being bruised and injured, but not destroyed as a result of experiencing that. So what he's experiencing as a young child, in some ways, I think, leads to a series of experiments that go throughout the entirety of his life. And what it is that kind of gives him a sense of the depths, the depraved depths that people will go to in relation to their treatment of others is something that's the store of his adult experience, and sometimes, surprisingly, adult experiences of those close to them and those committed to him, as well as the structural or institutional forces that brutalize. And I feel like Mary's point that being Black within the system does not exonerate you from the possibility of being an accomplice in relation to making the system operate. So that maybe what Wright is saying there is that we are all making choices in relation to this, and we should not have an easy, essentialist, obvious sorting of who are the good people and who are the bad people. The actions, the commitments, the solidarity, or the abuses, that sorts out which side you're on in relation to these struggles.
Well, that was the beautiful Zen answer that that I hoped for that took us on a journey with an author who was part of the world and stood apart from it to observe it and to help us go to places that we would never think of, and to touch places inside ourselves where we are parts of systems that we may hate or not even imagine that we are touching. So as our time is coming close to an end, I'm going to give each of you, so give thought to it, time. I'll give you a little of a time cue for your final answer. But before that, remember, this is a book brought to life by Julia Wright and the Wright Estate, our friends at Library of America, who also brought us Kevin Young's anthology, 250 Years of Black Poetry. I've learned more about Library of America than I ever knew, and maybe we'll put their website in the chat. But what can we infer from this example of that old saying that delayed is not denied? Delayed is not denied. This time capsule that we're opening now. And Gerard, please share your thoughts on that.
Delayed is not denied. You have to plant a seed knowing that one day you'll get a plant or a flower or a tree from it. But when you plant that seed, when you plant that great novel, The Man Who Lived Underground, it may not be seen for 80 years. So all of us on this panel today, as well as everyone who's listening, we all have seeds to plant. You know, we may not see the manifestation of the seed tomorrow, next week, or even our lifetime, but we still have a responsibility to plant that seed. You know, Wright shows us that the sewer is a metaphor of discomfort, refuge, and freedom. It's a morality play of sorts. Him descending after he shot Fred Daniels is a form of transcendence. So even though something horrible can happen, you can still transcend from that crucifixion and have a rebirth into an underground.
Beautiful. Mary, your thoughts?
Not sure I want to follow that, but you know, what the phrase "delayed is not denied" makes me think of is the long history of struggle. So in some regards, you know, Adam brought up this point that Wright makes a decision that Fred Daniels is going to go on his journey alone. Tracy also made the point that often we heal together. Interestingly, Fred Daniels is healing alone. There is a kind of loneliness I am reading from Wright, and of course from his life, as Adam says, his withdrawal from the US. And there's kind of an individual streak in this novel that I think is different from a model than someone like Fannie Lou Hamer. And I bring up Fannie Lou Hamer because as I was reading the book, Wright talks about the blackjack that Fred Daniels is being beaten with. And I teach Fannie Lou Hamer's speech to the Voting Rights Commission, where she talks about being beaten with the blackjack as she was trying to work on her political work in the South. So that blackjack image was across the two people, and Fannie Lou Hamer took a very different approach. She organizes a political party and she goes to Washington, D.C. to be seated. And it's all in community. And Fred Daniels goes underground by himself on a very, a journey, yes, but I don't know. I'm uncomfortable with it, I guess. And I am curious about that decision. So delayed is not denied makes me think about struggle, but really makes me think more about the struggle of someone like Fannie Lou Hamer than the kind of struggle we see in this book.
Well, thank you. All we can do is share our truths. Tracy, your thoughts? Delayed is not denied?
Yeah, definitely. I think in that we hear the echoes of Wright's grandmother, because we know that delayed is not denial. The preachers, I'm not a preacher's kid, but both of my uncles are bishops. And so I hear Corinthians in that, because that is a phrase that has become popular, but that is based in a biblical text. So I think about something that I think Guillermo Pena said, a performer and poet from Mexico City. He asked a question: Are we citizens of space and time? And I think that Wright situates himself as a citizen of space and time because he does the work. As Gerard says, he plants the seeds and allows them to bloom. And he does that by not trying to, he doesn't say no. When he's asked to just publish a section, he doesn't say no. He wants to give this text some light, probably understanding that its time may or may not come, but he is willing to allow some of it to see the light of day. And I'm also thinking too about Emerson's, and I'll close with this. Emerson's his treatise on friendship, when he says, "Shall I not be as real as the things I see?" I think that this text is also an act of giving, an act of communion for a larger community of workers, of laborers, and of people who have been disenfranchised. In this particular case, within the Black community, but also broader, and for all the reasons that we said. So when I think about delayed is not denied, I feel that it's also instructive for us, because we're talking about Juneteenth being a national holiday without voting rights, right, being fully restored. We're also talking, there's so many contradictions. I'm not going to enumerate them all because we'll be here all night. But when I think about delayed is not denied, I'm also thinking of hold on, children, hold on.
Very well said. Juan, do you want to briefly address that statement as well?
Sure. It's poignant, because, as Gerard and Mary said, we're never going to see the fruits of our labor in a lot of ways. And people have been struggling for justice for time immemorial in this country. For sure, African Americans and indigenous people have been struggling since before national identity. And so there is always the struggle, and it's very helpful to think of whatever work we do as planting seeds that really have to come to fruition. But there's also the loss, the poignance of never seeing the result. It's sad that he never saw his full book published, because it should have been as he wanted it in the first place. And it's also sad that we're not likely to see justice in our time. At least not what we think of as justice. So I would just leave it.
Thank you, Juan. We're trying to co-create that world, but there's a lot of real here. I'm going to shift into Adam giving your brief comment on that statement, if you feel that there's something that you'd like to add, and then I'll go to my very last question. But anything to add on delayed is not denied?
Yeah, quickly, one quick observation. I think that Tracy's right, that Wright is putting this book within space and time. It's interesting, though, he has this motif of taking watches, as well as jewels, as well as money, as well as tools, as well as guns, as well as a cleaver. And he puts the watches up on the wall and he sets them all at different times. So that sense of which time we're actually talking about, or whether sort of exiting out of time is partly about defying the sense that there's a unitary time and the time of the work clock that one has to put oneself to. I think that of all the books I know of Wright's, this oddly, it strikes me as the most hopeful, and there are some problems in terms of how much hope comes there, but read The Outsider sometime in terms of Cross Damon. Think about Bigger Thomas in relation to what Bigger Thomas comes to at the end in terms of his resolution. And I would say maybe even more appropriately, this is the most loving book. I see Wright identifying with this protagonist more than I do perhaps any other protagonist, including to some degree his own autobiographies of himself. So there's an interesting way, there's a tenderness in how he's doing that.
Well,
I think
that thought though, hold that thought, because I'm seeing the clock in my mind, and I'm going to give you the last word. I see Mary nodding. I'm going to ask this question. I had a flash to Afrofuturist, by the way, when you started saying clocks. I'm like, there's the proof. What are your thoughts, Mary, on what we can learn from this book, which was meant to be read 80 years ago? And what can it teach us in 2021? And give me your 30-second final answer.
Yep, my 30-second final answer is just about sitting with contradictions. So he says, life in the underground told him that though he were innocent, he was guilty. Though blameless, he was accused. Though living, he must die. Though possessing faculties of dignity, he must live a life of shame. Though existing in a seemingly reasonable world, he must die a certainly reasonless death. So these contradictions is really what I'm taking from the book.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you so much for being here. Juan Pereira, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I had mentioned before that it's really important that Richard Wright bore witness to the police brutality. And it's also telling that in his lifetime, the audience never got to see the results of him bearing witness. So I just want to say that some of you are probably familiar with the Kerner Commission report in 1968. And in that report, there's a chapter called Basic Causes of Urban Violence, Urban Insurrections, let's say. And one of the basic causes, the first one, was white racism, white discrimination in employment, education, et cetera. And one of the other causes was police misconduct, police brutality, and police racism. Now, this report is very straightforward about that. This is 1968. And I look now, and we don't talk in those terms.
Well, thank you. There's a lot of hidden, you wanted a direct comment.
Society did not learn from a presidential commission that has all the blue ribbons and everything, and all the gravitas, you name it. So there is a problem there of suppressed knowledge and a wish not to make things better that is powerful.
Tracy Hall, your thoughts on what this book can teach us today?
I just want to talk about the power of the book as a convening device. I'm going back to thinking about the efficacy, the importance of literature, of writing, of art. I think this conversation for me personally has been so fulfilling and illuminating. And this is the power that books have today to convene. And this is the power, honestly, I have to say this, that libraries have to curate, program, to bring us together. And I want to say that Chicago Public Library in the 40s began a history of convening people across races to talk about, at that point, what were called the great books. But I see us in the continuum, and I'm so happy to see this. And again, the power of Wright, the power of the book, the power of libraries.
Thank you. Gerard? You're on mute, sir.
You know, it's just, and this is definitely not any sort of pun at all, because you don't joke in this manner at an event like this. But I'm going to be honest with you, all during the reading of the book, I found myself panting. There were moments when I really could not breathe. You know, as Tracy mentioned, just the anger, and even, you know, the thought of the narrator saying he shot him and then he went down into the sewer like a whirling black object. So I would just hope that we're no longer looked upon as objects. And even though that Richard Wright uses that on purpose, you know, Fred feels the pervasive oxygen deprivation of having to show accountability even when innocent. We can only hope for a better day. That's all we can hope for. I think Richard Wright points us in the right direction, even though there are times of absurdity, surrealism, and existentialism in the book. I think that we can, like jazz music, rise and play a song a different way to achieve a goal that's better than what we did yesterday.
Beautifully said. Adam, your thoughts on the conversation with today?
So two quick points. One, big underline to Tracy's point about the power of literature, and particularly this work, to convene. And to understand that convening is not the same thing as tweeting. Convening is not the same thing as lecturing. Convening is not the same thing as doxing. Convening is not the same thing as shaming. That when you convene people around difficult works, and this is a difficult work for people who are thinking about taking it up, you then get to some place that's unexpected and probably useful in ways that you can learn from. And then the second point, which is kind of building off of what I was trying to say before, sometimes in order to deconstruct an unjust world, an inadequate world, a dysfunctional world, you've got to make a new one. You've got to experiment with coming up with a whole different world. And, the room with the money, the jewels, the watches, all of that stuff, the different kinds of meditations on the small guilts that the whites that he encounters then become larger guilts because they can't be assigned to his actions, which are partly about bringing himself in. And even I think his death at the end, sorry, yet again for a spoiler, because in a sense, and this is a long tradition within Black thought, if there's not something that you're prepared to die for, then in some ways you haven't really figured out how you're going to live. And I think in that sense, maybe what Wright is saying, again, is that this is someone who really sort of embodies his ambitions to what it means to kind of realize an evolution ethically within the world. It's a hero's journey for a novelist that was in the habit of writing anti-heroes. And he was one of the original people in terms of presenting that. And for that reason, there's much to learn about why he feels a closeness in terms of thinking about that protagonist.
Well, I want to thank each of you. You have proved the value of communication, of conversation, of honest reflection about your true feelings. I had to write some of our questions, and I wrote them in the woods on a beautiful morning because the pain that I had read in the book and the pain we see around us needs to be seen, felt, and balanced. How can we co-create the world we want to see, informed by this book from 80 years ago and informed by each of our experiences? And Mary said duality. I think that there are always contradictions and two sides. And which side do we want to feed and grow? So thank you to Dr. Adam Green, Tracy Hall, Gerard McClendon, Mary Patillo, and Juan Pereira. Thanks also to John Kukla and Chris Brown, who were here earlier. We couldn't have done it without you. Happy anniversary, Valida, and all go out, have a good night, plant the seeds you want to see grow, nurture them and water them. Thank you and good evening.